Enrichment, Enlightenment, Transformation. Rabbi Yisroel Cutler, the spiritual leader of Chabad of Cary, North Carolina, guides anyone who has been searching for a meaningful life and conscious living. Join our discussions about the mundane, our daily activities, and then infuse every day with a spiritual twist from the inspired sages of the Talmud and Jewish mysticism, which many call Kabbalah. We learn from the root source of all religious monotheistic traditions and delve into the symbolism and levels of meaning from biblical stories.
Everyone. Thank you, everyone. And we have an echo here, Amnon.
Fine now.
Both to those that are tuning in all over the world, wherever you may be, if you are, we would love you to let us know that you are tuning in via the chat, ask questions, take part in the conversation, as well as to the crowd here in Cary, North Carolina. Yeah, if you do open up to your books, does everyone have a book? Yeah, Pam noticed, and I only noticed it today, that my brother sponsored the National Torah Study in memory of his child. What page is that on, Pam?
Well,
If you open up to the
pages.
third or fourth page,
Yeah.
you'll notice a tribute to my nephew, Olav Shalom.
Oh, fourth page.
So actually, the JLI is developing an entire seminar on gratitude that my brother's working with them on right now. So you'll notice that on just the title page. But let's go into today's conversation. It's an interesting one. Do you know that there's a place in the world that Jews are not supposed to live? Egypt. And it's not so simple. Jews are actually everywhere. It's fascinating how Jews are literally everywhere. We're not a big people. How many Jews in the world? 17 million? 14 million? What numbers have you heard?
14.
14?
I haven't heard 17.
We know there was about 18 before the Holocaust. A third of the Jewish population was wiped out. It was around 12. So we're at 13, 14 right now on that level. But Jews are all over the world. I remember when I was moving here and I was driving from my hometown, originally Houston, to here. And I was driving through some of these southern states, Alabama and Mississippi. And I remember stopping off at one of these coastal towns and seeing some Israelis who were running the, like the swim shops, those kind of, I'm like, I can't even believe you made it over here. They're all over the world. Jews are literally all over the world. You go somewhere and maybe the population of Jews will be small, but we're everywhere. But yet, there is something in the Torah about not going to Egypt. Where is that from? Why is that so? And more broadly, why are Jews all over the world? Is it just because we got scattered? Or is there a positive reason for it as well? So that is where we are going to begin today. The lesson in the book, and we have a lot of books if anyone does not have one. It is lesson 3. We will begin with this week's Torah portion, but from there we will venture into other areas. Page 42. And our first text actually discusses a rabbi who was asked a question in the 1970s when peace agreements were being signed in Egypt, and a lot of Jews were in Egypt. The majority of those, as is typical in Israel, were not very religious, not observant, but there were some reporters that were Torah observant, and they were wondering if they could be living in Egypt, journalists, while this discussion was taking place. So Pam, read text 1. This is from Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who was a modern-day Jewish authority. He actually just passed away last year, I want to say. Text 1 on page 42.
I was asked by religious journalists, is it permissible to travel from Israel to Egypt to report on the negotiations taking place in Cairo?
So they asked their rabbi, am I allowed to spend a few weeks in Egypt while all of this was taking place? Anyone know where in the Torah does it say you shouldn't go to Egypt? Where does that come from?
Didn't I read that?
Where?
Isn't it where he, anyhow, talking about Lois, and was it Jacob? No, but Jacob went to Egypt.
Where in Torah does it say not to? What's the issue?
About verse 5 in this week's portion.
of the sea. But here is the verse in text 2:8. When the Jews are all excited, they leave Egypt, and then they turn behind them and they realize that the Egyptians are after them. Kimberly, do you mind reading? It's the second text, 2:8.
The Egyptians chased after them, every horse of Pharaoh's chariots, his horsemen, and his army, and overtook them encamped by the sea beside.
You don't have to worry. These are names of places. That's fine.
Okay. Pharaoh drew near, and the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were advancing after them. They were very frightened, and the children of Israel cried out to God. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us to die in the desert? What is this that you have done to us to take us out of Egypt? Is this not the thing about which we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, and we will serve the Egyptians, because we would rather serve the Egyptians than die in the desert'?"
You're wondering where sarcasm is first mentioned in the Bible? Here you have it. Isn't that great?
What about gratitude?
That was 3 days earlier. But hey, you know what? We don't know what it's like to have a sea in front of us and an Egyptian army behind us, right? And in fact, the Jews are not like punished for complaining at this point in time, because they, honestly, it was a pretty scary situation. This is very different than later in the wilderness where they complain, "Where's the beef?" or something like that. You know, "Where's the meat? We want meat." They honestly were scared, and they were a slave. This was before they got the Torah. They were an infant nation. We cannot even imagine the level of fear. I just find it fascinating how they are sarcastic. This is when Jews became, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to take us here? Isn't that funny that in the Bible already there's sarcasm? But that's not what the class is about. But yeah, if someone ever asks you that question, where's there sarcasm in the Bible? Remember this one.
At the sea of reeds.
There we go. Moses responds to the people, and he says, "Do not fear." Do the next verse. To be.
And Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, stand still and see the salvation of God, which he will work through you today. For whereas you have seen the Egyptians today, you shall see them again no more forever."
Okay. So Moshe tells them, don't worry, guys. Have faith. God took you this far. The 10 plagues was not just to get to this point and then collapse at this point. Have faith. And by the way, you're worried about the Egyptians. You will never see them again. So simply put, it's just reassuring the Jewish people that this is the last they will have to worry about the Egyptians. Other commentators see this differently. There is not just a reassurance taking place over here, but there's an actual command. You should not see them again. Okay? So, indeed, if you look at one of the most famous medieval commentators, his name was Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides. We'll get to his opinion later. He lived in the 1100s and the 1200s, so he was a philosopher. He lived in Spain when it was still good for the Jews in Spain, 1200s. And he writes, and why don't you read?
Our sages explain that this verse is a positive commandment that applies to all generations. If so, the verse is saying two things. First is, do not fear. Stay where you are and you will witness God's salvation, who will save you from the Egyptians. Second, God is commanding you not to return, that you shall no longer see these Egyptians by your own will ever again.
Okay, so it's the second part is a command. You are not to go back. What I didn't tell you is even at the Reed Sea, there was 4 different opinions amongst the Jews what they should do. Some say let's return to Egypt. Some said, what do you think?
Fight them.
Fight. Some said commit suicide.
Some said pray.
Some said pray. And Moshe ends up saying none of the above, just have faith and go forward type of thing. So actually in this verse itself is the answer to all of them. Do not fear means don't give up hope. Don't return back to Egypt. The end of the verse says, be quiet. Not even a time for prayer. Just Nike, just go forward. Just do it. In any event, the Jews are told not to see Egypt again. You might say, is that really a source for not going back to Egypt? Is there anywhere else in the Torah that alludes to that? There's one other place. much later in the Torah, there's laws about a Jewish monarch, a king. And there's certain commands about what a Jewish king is not allowed to have. It says he cannot have too much money just to show off his wealth. One of the things he was not allowed to have is too many horses. It says he's allowed to have enough horses for his cavalry, for his military, but not too much as a display of wealth. And the verse explains, because in those days, horses were always traded in Egypt. And look what the verse says in Deuteronomy text 4. Barbara, please read.
You shall set a king over you, one whom the Lord your God chooses from among your brothers. You shall set a king over yourself. You shall not appoint a foreigner over yourself, one who is not your brother. Only he may not acquire many horses for himself, so that he will not bring the people back to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. For God said to you, you shall not return that way anymore.
So that's a clear indication of the fact that you should not go back to Egypt. Right? Apparently horses were traded over there as a prevention against Jews going back to Egypt. Again, they're told, don't even have too many horses. So two different places. Why? Why can't we go to Egypt?
You know, is this in reference to more of it? But of course, the way they're describing it is making it a physical place.
So what
But
you're asking
Egypt-
is maybe it was just these specific people who
The
were
or the-
associated with the slavery, but maybe times changed. So that's what you're asking.
Or
Is
say a
the
moment.
prohibition associated with a location, or is the prohibition associated with the people? Right, that's a good point.
Mhm.
That's a good point.
Or is it a spiritual thing?
Or is it a spiritual thing? Which is another perspective on this. So we're good to see that. Okay. Now, I don't want to do this midrash inside right now because of time, but this midrash says 3 different times in history Jews did establish communities in Egypt. Each time it was a failure. One of them was in the times of the first temple, one is in the second temple. Each time there was no remnants of the community and they were destroyed. And the midrash writes, that's what God said, it's not a good idea to go back to Egypt. So there was actually a famous community in Alexandria for a period of time. It says they built a humongous synagogue. It says the synagogue was so big, look at the end of text 6. It says that when it came time to say Amen in Shul, someone had to wave a scarf in order that the people in the back should know it's time to say. They had no sound systems or Shabbat, whatever. They had to wave it. That's how big the community was. But it says that the Roman Emperor Trajan killed them all because, again, the Torah says they were not supposed to go back. I want to just go skip by over these texts because of time. But 3 times Jews attempted to go back to Egypt. It did not work. Okay, so our questions, first of all, are why? B is, are there any other examples of places Jews shouldn't live? And third of all is, anyone know of any famous Jewish people that did live in Egypt?
Maimonides.
Yeah. Let's go.
You were going to say Maimonides? Maimonides, who was a famous doctor, rabbi, philosopher, codifier of Jewish law, lived in Alexandria for 4 decades. So why would it be that the same people who were, well, we'll see what Maimonides says himself. First, let's see the words of Maimonides. Forget about what he did in his own life. What does Maimonides actually write in his book? What Maimonides did is he took the entire Jewish law, which was all scattered in various places of the Talmud, and he made an encyclopedia of Jewish law. So if you want to know about any particular mitzvah, one of the best places to see is Maimonides. He writes in the 1100s, text 7, Hal.
It is permitted to dwell anywhere in the entire world with the exception of the land of Egypt. This territory includes a square of 400 parsecs by 400 parasecs.
I'm not sure what the unit of conversion to miles is. I don't know what a parsec is, but okay.
From the Mediterranean Sea proceeding westward, bordering the land of Cush and the desert. It is forbidden to dwell in this entire territory. In 3 places the Torah warned against returning to Egypt. God has told you must never return on that path. 2, you shall not see it again. And lastly, you shall never see them again forever.
So I guess there's a third text somewhere there as well. I don't see sources over here. I'm not sure where the third text is. And he writes, Alexandria, by the way, is included in this prohibition. And so the question is asked, first of all, anyone here ever visit Egypt? It's fine if you did. Don't.
No.
Anyone?
No.
No.
Somebody
lived
would-
in
My
Egypt.
brother left it. He was in
Somebody
Israel
would
for a
let it-
while, and he went to Egypt.
I
He was
lived, in,
the,
I lived in Israel for 2 years. I've been to Israel, I don't know, over 20 times. I've never been to Egypt. I just haven't. I've always wanted to go see the pyramids, but I just didn't
Alright,
have
so-
an opportunity.
And mommy didn't let her go.
By the way, the consensus of
Mommy
today is
didn't let me
you're
go.
allowed to go visit. You're just not allowed to live there. So we're going to get there in a moment, so you don't have to be afraid if you answer
Wait,
yes
so-
to that
okay,
question.
so let
We,
me-
we didn't get there yet. Let's hold our, let's, yeah.
But you can visit, you're just not allowed to own property?
We'll get there.
Okay.
We'll get there. Okay. So the question then would be, and these are what many of these commentators says, Maimonides, you're saying you're not allowed to live in Egypt. Why then
Did he?
did you, and not only he, but there are other examples, Zogazon, in medieval times, Zogazon, of Jews, other Torah scholars living there. So the commentators are kind of struggling with what the Torah says on one hand, with what people actually did on the other hand. It seems like a classic example of hypocrisy. So they have to come up with, why did people do that? So we're going to have different answers. It's interesting. They're all from the 1300s, all of the answers that we're going to read.
Right.
So the first is Egypt then is not what Egypt is today. Text 9. Do you mind reading? Page 50.
Mom is reading.
No. Okay.
No, okay. Text now. This was a temporary measure to ensure that the Jews would not learn from the Egyptians' ways, as the Egyptians were famous for being sunk into every possible abomination.
They were the most immoral, corrupt society of the time. Okay?
It is not a commandment for all time forbidding Jews from living in Egypt forever. Indeed, we have seen many congregations living there until this very day. If the prohibition was permanent, Jews who are innately righteous would not have been lax about this, and had they been, the sages of the generations would have protested.
Okay, I mean, it's a tough logical reason. It's like, Rabbi, it's got to be okay. I saw this person do it, right? I always get that. And what's the answer you usually say? Just because you saw someone doing it doesn't mean it's right. I get that all the time. In this case, it's a little different. We are dealing with spiritual giants. We don't like dismiss Maimonides easily. It's not just I saw Joe doing it. This is Maimonides. But still, Rabbeinu Bachaya, who was this commentator in the 1200s, says it must have been something about the Egypt of the time that was prohibited, but it didn't mean the geographical location of Egypt. Now, from Maimonides' words, however, he seems to put the emphasis on the physical location. I mean, the 400 parsangs by he doesn't mention the people or the culture. He seems to say the location. Rabbeinu Bachaya seems to put the emphasis more on the culture. There's another opinion in text 10 who writes that it was specifically a prohibition. Let's do this, just the second paragraph inside. The second paragraph of 10. Jackie, do you want to read just the second paragraph?
sorry.
Excuse me, where is it? Page 51. Right here, page 51. Right here, right here. Hold on.
This one? No, here.
Second paragraph.
However, the soundest explanation is that the prohibition applies only when Jews live in the land of Israel. Nowadays, when it has been decreed that we disperse throughout the globe, there is no difference between Egypt and the other parts of the diaspora. The only prohibition today is to willingly leave Israel.
So in biblical times, when all the Jews were living in Israel and there were no Jews anywhere else in the world, and the Jews were told, you're leaving Egypt, you're going to the promised land, you're not allowed to go back. But once Jews were living all over the world, at that point there's no difference between Egypt and the rest of the world. So this is a third spin on it. So you see there's a lot of debate even amongst the Jewish positions. Which one of the positions do you agree with the most so far?
The last one.
None, Pam? None do it for you? They all seem a way out over here. They all seem to be...
It says you're not supposed to, you're not supposed to. Yeah, just like you can explain it and twist it, but you're not supposed to.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Online community, anyone listening in? Anyone? Any comments to share?
Well, I think it's because Ra, the Pharaoh, thought he was God. So he was going to that one God status. So I think that the Jews could be more easily confused in the belief of one God since they're believing in one Ra. But in the diaspora, they met all of the people and all of their beliefs. And
So as an infant nation, it was important that they don't become affected by the idolatry of Egypt, but as times changed, we were exposed to all sorts of influences that no
Right,
longer
and
apply.
again-
So that, right, but we have to be very careful with doing that, because then you can go through any of the mitzvot in the Torah, right, fam? And you can
Yeah.
give a reason for it, and then you can come up with it no longer applies today. And we know in traditional Judaism, we don't do that. There's a mitzvah in the Torah, it means it's eternal. It doesn't mean we come up with a reason why it only applied then, it's from God. So unless there was something from the beginning that that would place the limitation on that, we need a good reason why Jews still live there today. Okay, well, Jews don't live there today, actually. I don't think Egypt has. Anyone? Are there Jews? There are?
I think so.
Anyone know?
you know, they show those beautiful pictures of those Egyptian Jews that were all dead.
I don't know about today, though. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
not sure.
that's true too.
So-
those pictures.
So Maimonides, text 11 writes, Maimonides and others don't give any of these answers. They say it has nothing to do with the culture or the people, but rather it's simply a decree of the Torah and you're forbidden to leave in Egypt, period. Well, then how did Maimonides himself do it? So we're still left with that question. So the main answer that we're going to suggest before we get into the spiritual answer is going to be, well, let me put it this way. Maimonides' grandson writes, and we don't have this in your text, he heard that in many of Maimonides' own letters, he would write it to people and he would sign his name, Moshe ben Maimon, who transgresses 3 prohibitions daily. And while there's some debate whether or not that is actually true, that is a quote from his grandson. So it seems that on one hand, his grandfather did it. On the other hand, he was uncomfortable with it. And perhaps why 3? Because there's 3 times in the Torah it says not to live in Egypt. So some insist that that narrative is not correct, but there are some that believe that. What would be the reason for it? So let's do text 12a finally, another perspective. Where are we up to? Pam?
We intend to return.
12a, let's do 12a.
12a.
Yeah.
Wait,
52.
12a. The Torah prohibits a person from going to live in Egypt and making it permanent. As it says in the Talmud Yerushalmi,
Yerushalmi is part of the Talmud.
you may not return to live there, but you may return there for merchandise and business. And indeed, those who first went to Egypt went not to live, but to conduct business. And although ultimately they settled there, remaining there after having originally come permissibly, it is not a violation of the actual prohibitive mitzvah, although it is nevertheless forbidden as an issur.
Isser means something lighter, not something good, but not an actual violation. Keep on reading.
Because of the strain of travel and poor economic conditions elsewhere, the issur was not considered an issue. In the case of Maimonides, it may be said that after initially committing in a permissible manner, he was forced to remain by the royal house, for he was physician to the king, sultan, and his ministers.
So Maimonides might have been forced to live there. Why did Maimonides originally go to Egypt? Anyone know? To escape persecution. He was running for his
Spain?
life.
From Spain? No?
I think so.
I guess that's what it says.
I believe so. France or Spain. There were horrible pogroms. Might have been France. I need to. Spain?
Born in Cordoba, Spain.
Spain. Good.
He fled Spain and eventually settled in Cairo.
Okay, so he was running for his life, which we know if you're running for your life, you can go anywhere except for 3 commandments in the Torah: idolatry, murder, and adultery. One is allowed to violate a mitzvah in the Torah to save your life, except for those 3. Not for today, for another subject. So he runs there permissively. He gets a job there. He becomes a doctor. Eventually, he becomes the Sultan's doctor. Well, if you're the Sultan of Spain's doctor, of Egypt's doctor, it's not so easy to just pick up and leave. He may not have been allowed to leave. And so he stayed. But he was not comfortable with that decision, and hence he wrote that I live here uncomfortably. So what the Radbaz is suggesting, that all the Jews that began there were there under permissible situations. They never intended to live there. Even while they were there, maybe they were living out of their suitcase. But as we know, it was not easy in those days to pick up and leave. It was a dangerous world. And so Jews stayed there uncomfortably. And that is pretty much going to be the answer to the question. Most authorities say that visiting there is not a problem. That's where I started off with, Danielle. Visiting is not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
You can visit Cairo, I don't know, you know. I wouldn't suggest me walking around like this over there. Might not be the best idea. Visiting is not a problem. Living there is a problem. The people that went there never intended on living there permanently, but what often happens in life is life happened and eventually got too difficult to leave. Nonetheless, although they never violated the actual biblical prohibition of moving there permanently, they still were doing an Isur. They were still doing something wrong. Perhaps, though, in the case of Maimonides, he had no ability to leave.
So is that because of the intention, that they never had the intention?
The verse says you should not go back to live.
Right.
They didn't go back to live. They went back to escape.
And then just
Once they were there, they were there. So it was not something proper.
Right.
So that is good. Correct.
So really the key is always with the intention. They never had the intention of living there, it just kind of unfolded organically.
Correct. And in the case of Maimonides, he may literally not have had a choice. But I do find it fascinating, if it is true that he signed his letters that way, that he never came to peace with it. But he felt it was necessary to save his life. It might have been that he had a responsibility to other people over there.
Right.
Who knows? So we still, though, are left, yes?
Quick question. Is it true that the Rebbe never went to Israel?
That is true.
Because once you're there, you shouldn't be leaving.
So you know what? If we have time at the end, it's a fascinating issue. The short answer is the Rebbe said if he did go to Israel, he would not want to leave afterwards. In short, Israel is the holiest of all the places in the world, and you're supposed to go up in holiness and not down. And it actually says that if you live in Israel, you should not leave except for like 3 major reasons. One is if you have absolutely no choice financially. One is to get married, to study Torah, but you're not supposed to leave just because, Most opinions say that is only true if you are living in Israel. But if you visit Israel, it's okay to leave. The Rebbe didn't feel that, and he said, if I was in Israel, I wouldn't be able to leave.
I get it. Every time I go, I have trouble.
It's interesting. It's interesting.
Oh Lord, it's a.
But it's a fascinating issue, and
every time from the time we even land, my mother's like, I'm having anxiety about leaving. I'm like, we have 2 weeks, Mom. Doesn't matter.
So the question though is why? It could be the Torah just says that's the fact, and all those that the lesson of the class is still coming. Most of us are not traveling to Egypt anytime soon, so why is this practical to us? We're going to get there in a moment. But our Rebbe, who you asked never visited Israel, asks this question on page 54 in Jersey. It's 54, text 14. The Rebbe writes,
why is Egypt different from all the other lands of the nations of the world? If anything, Jews should have a better relationship with Egypt than they do with other nations. As it is stated, do not despise the Egyptian, for you were a stranger in his land.
So the Rebbe says, why would it be that the Torah singles out Egypt in this regard? There have been other nations that have not been kind to us. And in fact, Egypt for a period of time was very good to us, because when there was hunger in Israel, Jacob and his entire family went down to Egypt. Joseph was the viceroy of Egypt. And for that reason, the Torah says, don't despise Egyptians. You actually were a stranger in their land, and they treated you well for a period of time. By the way, it's a very interesting verse, because that's teaching us another lesson. We don't generalize. It's very easy for Jews to say, Egypt, never again. There was actually a period of time when the Egyptians were good for us, and we can't treat every Egyptian the same way. I don't want to go there, but it's interesting. In any event, the Rebbe asks this question, should we start placing bans today on any nation that was bad for us? Well,
No.
believe it or not, throughout history, there were attempts to do that.
Really?
This would not be on the same level biblically. The only place that the Bible singles out is Egypt, but there were some places. So one example, this is just interesting from history, text 55, we know that the Jews were expelled from Spain in what year?
1492.
1492. Jews were expelled from Spain. a few decades afterwards, Portugal followed as well. And in this, so there was actually a place, and why don't you read your, Michael, what's your first name is Michael. 15a. This is an interesting text. This is a modern day rabbi who writes, Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Toledano, okay?
Wrote in his book,
Mm-hmm.
our fathers told us that members of the
Toledano family.
those origins are in Toledo.
Mm-hmm. This is not Toledo, Ohio. This is Toledo, Spain.
Banned themselves from ever returning to Toledo. This is how they got the name Toledo, similar to Tornado in Spain.
Toledo, no. Isn't that interesting? So they call themselves the Toledano family because they made a ban in their family after the Inquisition that they were never allowed to go to Toledo. Now, this is not in Jewish law. This is not in halacha. This was a family's ban. So it is interesting how they did that. There is another example, and I know of this. Jews were expelled in England once. This is very surprising to people. People always think that the English had good, but there was a time in I think it was the 1100s, and there was a massacre in the city of, anyone know where in England? York. And up until today, there's actually a fortress over there where the Jews were massacred. I remember I visited it. And after that, when the Jewish community was totally destroyed, they said Jews should not spend a night overnight in York. So again, there was an attempt to have a ban on that. And you can imagine in text 15c, I'm just summarizing over here, there's a rabbinic conference after the Holocaust to say that maybe Jews should not go back to Germany.
It's so interesting.
But yeah.
My father-in-law was a survivor, and my husband was actually born in Germany. And when he heard after we got married that I wanted my husband to see where he was born, he went visit my father-in-law was livid that we would go to Germany.
Wow.
He was absolutely livid that we would go.
Yeah, which is another interesting discussion when it comes to that. Do you judge grandchildren, great-grandchildren from a country because of the sins of the grandparents, great-grandparents? When a Jew says, I'll never buy a Mercedes or buy a German, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, my friend's mother had to make parts for Mercedes during the war. And
what would you say? I mean, do you understand that sentiment when people say that?
absolutely. Yeah.
Do you also understand why people would not understand that?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. If you were a
Absolutely.
survivor, I get that. At the same time, I could understand
Right. But the
how the Torah
reparations-
says not to punish children for the sins of
Their
their parents. That's in the Torah,
So
So I can understand both ways because it's such an emotional issue. Someone feels that way, that's
Right.
fine with them, but there would be no Torah prohibition with buying a German-made product today. I mean, it's
So the reparations to Israel,
Mhm.
like all the taxi cabs in Israel are Mercedes because they get Mercedes
Oh,
so
really?
cheap
I didn't know that.
that most of the cabs in Israel
Interesting.
are Mercedes. And I sold a very high-end luxury apartment in Miami this last year, and it was 2 blocks away from the Shul of Bell Harbor, which is Chabad, Rabbi Lipskar, and all of the not all, but most of the observant, affluent.
It's a very
clients
affluent area.
we
That
had-
shul is a
Right.
gorgeous synagogue.
It's unbelievable. And we were building just 2 blocks up. So this is an ultra luxury condo,
Yeah, yeah.
right? With Shabbat elevators and like double kitchen, the whole thing to accommodate for the
Orthodox community there.
Orthodox community, but also for the very high end community. And there's a maker of appliances that we had, and these were Argentinian Jews building. The
Okay.
developer was an Argentinian Jew. It was Collier. No, gosh, whatever it was. And we had issues
Because they did not want to buy
because
German-made products.
because the ovens were the ovens that were made by that company.
Was it Siemens?
So-
Siemens is a German brand.
No. It was
Okay, it's not-
whatever it was.
And they said these are the ovens that the Jews.
Oh,
were
okay,
cooked in.
yeah.
So they wouldn't. And
It's
so
an
they
emotional
have-
issue. There's no halachic or legal basis to it. It's an emotional issue. I wouldn't argue with someone that had that feeling, particularly if they were a survivor
Right, we
or
just
children
got
of
a new oven,
survivors.
that was it,
But
it
at the
was
same
really
time,
interesting.
there's no Torah issue with that. So the Rebbe asks this question, why is it that Egypt is different? Why would the Torah tell us you can't go back? Although there were sages that attempted to say that for other places, such bans never lasted. The Egypt ban is still on. Not for visiting, but for living. Why would that be so? So in order to answer this question, we just have 3 minutes. But this is the point of the lesson. If there's anything to take out of it, is this. Why are we all over the world? Forget about Egypt for a moment. One is we've been persecuted. One, we've been spread out. But there's another idea as well. And this is a very, very important Hasidic principle. And the Hasidic principle is, let's do text 17. This is from the Rebbe. And the Rebbe writes as follows. You want to read it?
Sure. In the early period of his leadership, the Alter Rebbe,
Which was the first Chabad Rebbe, yeah.
taught, the footsteps of man are directed by God. When a Jew comes to a particular place, it is for an inner divine intent and purpose, to perform a mitzvah, whether a mitzvah between man and God or a mitzvah between man and his fellow man. A Jew is God's messenger. Wherever a messenger may be, he represents the power of the one who
So a
sent
very
him.
important Hasidic principle is divine providence. And divine providence means wherever we go, we are messengers from God. And when we find ourselves in a particular place, someone asks, why are you there? Oh, I'm there because of a business trip. I'm there because my husband wanted this place for a vacation. I'm there because my flight got canceled and I got a layover here. The Hasidic answer is, that might be true, but there's got to be a deeper reason you're here as well. There's something you need to accomplish in the world, and therefore you being sent over here. Wherever we are, we need to view ourselves as messengers from God to accomplish something. And this is particularly true when we find ourselves in an odd place. And a lot of people might have stories. I got to finish the thing here. We just have a few minutes, and then afterwards we can discuss this. But when you find yourself in an odd situation, you run out of gas and you find yourself somewhere, you're a layover. Sometimes that's particularly to ask, why am I here? What is it there that I can accomplish? Who can I meet? Who can I inspire? We are always on the offensive looking for an opportunity to do a mitzvah. And I can't tell you what a difference this perspective means. You're never stuck anywhere. You are sent somewhere. As such, the Kabbalah explains that all over the world there are, I'll use the word of the Kabbalah, sparks of holiness. Sparks means the potential for holiness that are embedded in places and in physical stuff. And when we are sent somewhere, we are sent there to elevate, to do a mitzvah with that item or with that purpose, and that elevates, that redeems, that purifies that particular spark. And each one of us has specific tasks to accomplish that no one else in the world can do. We each have an indispensable role to play in certain sparks that only we can redeem. As such, when we find ourselves in places, I have countless stories like this. I'm sure people around the room can say stories like this. I happen to be in this place at this time and I met this, it's for a reason. And since such sparks are all over the world, all people have mitzvot to do, but in particular the Jewish people, God's ambassadors in the world, are found in places all over the world. We have to live all over the world in order to do our mission, with one exception.
Egypt.
Why?
Wonder what's going to happen.
Why? What had to be accomplished in Egypt was done. So the Rebbe writes, and we'll finish with this, verse 19a. Where are we up to in the reading? Anne?
19a?
Yes. 19a.
God said,
this is from the Arizal, yes?
God said, you will never see them again. What did he decree? Why did he decree so only about Egypt and not so for the other places of exile? The purpose of the exiles was for the Jews to refine the divine sparks that were mixed up with the
within the
flesh.
shell, the klipot, we kind of have a lesson in Kabbalah, but it's the shell, the husk, that covers over these sparks. Yes?
But during the Egyptian exile, the Jews succeeded in extracting all the holiness that was embedded in Egypt. Nothing remains. That is why God decreed that the Jews were never to see them again.
Okay, and this idea for us is very powerful, and I'll finish with this last text on page 60. When a Jew goes to a particular place, they must realize it's divine providence that's leading them there. The footsteps of man are directed by God. Whenever we go somewhere, we're to establish Hashem's name in that place. What that means is to make a sanctification of God's name. I was at Starbucks this morning meeting with someone, and then right away there was someone else who noticed I was a rabbi and asked me a question, and then a whole discussion happened with a group of people that were meeting, and it was incredible. I mean, I obviously, because I walk around like this,
Right.
it's easy for such stories to happen to me.
Right.
And it's like, that's why I happened to meet this person at this Starbucks today. Now I have this person's email address, but we see those stories happening to us. It's to recite a blessing or doing a mitzvah in that place. It follows that a Jew has no reason to go to a place where godliness was already revealed, because it's forbidden to go there. There's no purpose in going there. So therefore the Torah tells us when the Jews left Egypt, interesting verse in this week's Parsha, it says they emptied Egypt. What does it literally mean they emptied Egypt?
They took everything.
They took all the valuables. It says that the Egyptians gave them valuables. So they had already elevated. And what did they end up doing with those valuables? A lot of them? Okay, some they used for the golden calf, okay. But others, they built the Mishkan, the tabernacle. So they used it for holiness. That is what we do with materialism in the world. Physicality, we use to help other people. We use it for tzedakah, charity. We use it to live a holy life ourselves, for our children. So anything physical can be elevated, and that is why we find ourselves all over the world. But that is the spiritual reason for why there's no need to go back to Egypt. I have a question on that. I'd like to ask the Rebbe the question, and that is, since that time, many other people have moved and gone to Egypt, bringing more valuables and more missions with them. Could not sparks from other places have returned to Egypt, thus requiring us? I don't know the answer to that question. But we got to leave with the Torah's prohibition about leaving in Egypt, and most of all, the most important take-home is wherever we are, we ask ourselves, what am I doing here? We should know there's something to accomplish. And sometimes it happens in the most regular events. I saw a beautiful YouTube clip, and if anyone wants it, I'll email it to them. It happened in New Jersey. Someone might have already seen it, but there was a woman who was driving and stopped for gas. And as you know, in New Jersey, the gas is always an attendant, right? You can't do it yourself. The story is particularly meaningful for us because, I don't know if you know, my wife has a brother who's very, very small, about 3 feet, 3.5 feet. Okay, I don't know if you knew that, Shmuley. So there was a gas attendant there who was barely over 3 feet and also disabled in other ways as well. And she got gas from this person, and as he was filling up the gas attendant noticed in her car a picture. It was a picture of her father. She said, "Hey, who is that? Is that person related to you?" And she goes, "Yeah, that was my father." He goes, "Was?" He goes, "Well, he passed away a few months ago." And this gas attendant starts to cry. And he says he used to get gas here very regularly. And each time, he would be the only person that would talk. I mean, everyone else, I filled up their gas, and that was the extent of the relationship. He would talk to me. He would make me feel good. And he would say, "You're often my inspiration. When I don't want to get up in the morning, I think of you who have every reason to stay, and you get up and you do your job every day, and you're my inspiration." And he made me feel so good. And I can't believe that was your father. And they made a beautiful YouTube clip out of this. But the divine providence and the fact that she had the picture and he noticed, and the idea that wherever you go, you can do a mitzvah, and simply getting gas, there's an opportunity there to do a good deed. There's a lot of lessons to learn from this story. So it was a good YouTube clip. It's a 5-minute clip. We'll hold it here. Any questions? Comments?
No. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
All right.
They did have the why you have to be an American to be president in that section. No king over you that Florida.
Can't be. That's interesting. So that's where it comes from, right?
No king of what?
Not to have a king over you that is a Florida.
The verse that said a king can't have too many horses also said that the king has to be a local.
Except for Solomon.
All right. Thank you for everyone that joined us from online. If you have any questions, you can email it to us, yc@chabadofcary.org. We will be back, God willing, next week, same time, same place. And a big thank you to Amnon Nissan of Nissan Communications for making the live stream possible.
I think you did misreading.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. Our weekly lineup of call-in programs includes Computers 2K Now with Amnon Nissan, My Life, My Will with Gisela DiCarlo, The Tanya Love Show, Health Then with Debbie Bruck, Breaking Free with Marilyn Shannon, Triangle Be Well with Howard Jacobson, Lunch and Learn with Rabbi Yisrael Cutler, Lessons of Vietnam with NCVVI members, Parent Dome with Ryan Miller, Current Affairs with Amnon Nissan. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.